Hello Internet! Today we're going to be playing a little bit more with Java. I'm going to be introducing a builder pattern that I've sort of been playing around with a bit that I think is really neat. So the idea with the typical builder pattern is when you need to construct an object, sometimes constructors aren't the best way to go. So right now we have our greeting view model. So this is coming straight from our Spring demonstration. What this does is it creates a simple greeting, says hello, gives you an ID that is atomic, so it increments. So every time you call it, it increases. And then you also have this local date time that is grabbing that and then displaying that. So the end result is something that looks a little bit like this. The date time, the timestamp, is something that I added afterwards just so we can have some more stuff to play with here. But that's sort of what we're going to be working with. So the idea of a builder, instead of having these long constructors, so this is a short constructor, it's just an example. But sometimes you'll get an object that has a lot of information on it. Maybe it has dozens of arguments. And when you need to do that, it's not the most easy thing to just write a constructor. And even with a builder, traditionally builders just have each of these arguments as a single parameter, so it's effectively just naming them. What I've been working with is if you add an interface before it, you can actually sort of construct how you would actually step through, and that way you get compile time errors when you're trying to execute these builders, because it's very procedural. You know exactly the next step to take, and it's almost state machine styled instead of just being freeform, which there's some limitations imposed there, and it does add more code. We're going to get to that, but I think it's really nice. It makes the code nicer. So that's sort of the general overview. Let's get started. I don't really have much here. I kind of started working on it, and then I figured we haven't covered how to make a builder, so we're gonna do that too. So this is, I just have our greeting view model. This is just a static method on it, so you'll just call greeting view model.builder instead of a new greeting view model. That'll build your builder, and that's just an internal static class that we're going to return from this. And so I'm going to have some IDs, the content, and effectively I am just duplicating everything that is already there. If you have setters on your data object, we don't here, but if you do, you can actually really easily duplicate those. So instead of creating all of this stuff over again, you can actually just create a copy of this inside your builder and just use that. That works. It's kind of a little bit funky, but it works. So there we go. There's all of that. We have our new builder. And that is going to, how do we want to do this? Let's create a new public, let's create a private builder. And so there's no arguments here. This is just going to initialize everything. So after that, our ID, we already have a greeting view model controller. There's an atomic long here. Gonna pull that into our builder as well. And that can be static, so it's maintained over the use of these builders. So each builder is going to actually reference the same atomic long. We don't need this here anymore. And I can actually just pull this out entirely. So now our builder can set the ID immediately. We already know what the answer should be. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to set it. We don't need to do anything. It's already there. We've got that. Then we're just going to add two functions. So we're going to have a public. Normally builders are procedural. They'll return themselves. So if I do a builder, so as the return type, and just say content, for example, then that's going to take a string of our content. That's kind of a gross name, but we'll do this .content equals the content, like so. Do this again. I don't have return types, so we'll get to that in a second. But then we do a local date time, and we'll just give it our timestamp. And we just need to do the same thing again, like that. And let's make that a this, just so it's clear what we're referencing. Why? Oh, spelled it wrong. There we go. Got it. And then we just need to return this. And so this is a very simple builder pattern. The only thing we have to do now is actually add a build function to this, which is just going to return our greeting view model. And so when I call build, that's going to actually return a new greeting view model with our ID. So this.id, this.content, and this.timestamp. And so it just passes those functions in. Ideally, you would have some sort of validation here, because usually you implement these kind of builder patterns when there's some validation or there's some extra stuff going on that doesn't really fit into a constructor. We don't really have any of that because, again, example, but you get the general idea. So what I'm going to end up doing is make this private so nobody else can create instances of these without going through the builder. So the builder is the only way now to create a greeting view model. So that's going to cause us some pain over here because that's exactly what we're trying to do. So if I do a greeting view model and create a builder, like so, we don't need our counter because we move that inside. And then we just do the string name. This is not going to be right, but I want to do builder dot. What? I feel like I'm missing something because this should have worked. Unless I'm missing something entirely, which is very possible. We may need some more, yeah. Our class needs to be public so people can actually see it. There we go. And so you'll see we get three functions. We get our build, our content, and our timestamp. The problem with this whole thing is that I could just call build right now, and theoretically we would want to add some sort of, if there's a problem here, like if we don't have content or we don't have a timestamp, throw an exception. But we don't have any of that right now. And so because of that, even if you did implement all of that fun stuff, this is still a problem because you only run into that scenario at runtime. You don't run into that when you're compiling, and that's where we want to get. We want as many compile errors as possible because those are easier to detect. You don't need to execute over every code path. They just, if it doesn't compile, it doesn't compile. So we're going to do a content, going to give it some, I guess we can just plug in the string format. We already have that there. And then after that, we're going to do a quick timestamp, which is just going to be our local date time dot now. I had that below, but it's just easier to type it again. And then let's just build it. And this is where we want to get to. This is a fully formed object. It's what we want. The thing is again, if I take some of these out, it still is fine. There's nothing wrong with me deleting the timestamp. It just means we don't have a timestamp anymore. And then when I serialize it, we just miss that, which you don't always want. So there's errors that are undetectable in this way, or just really hard to deal with because if all of these start being able to throw exceptions, you're going to have a massive try catch block, and recovering from that is impossible. So the idea here is to kind of expand on this whole builder pattern. We're going to add a few extra interfaces. And so the way this works is instead of implementing a builder and just having that be passed around, you pass around interfaces that only allow you to do the next steps. So one interface connects to the next interface, which connects to the next interface, and so forth. And because of that, you can actually implement these complex patterns and force them to be the way they want, because the return types are set. You can only get certain things from them. So the first one I'm going to do, because it's just the easiest, is just an iBuilder, which is just going to build the thing. And so these are all internal classes. They're not exposed anywhere else, so we can use these relatively generic terms. But this is actually just going to return a greeting view model. And that's all we need. So the greeting view model is just going to say build. There we go. That is our iBuilder. So let's implement that like so. And now this little build function is going to be coming from here. So we're going to add an override. And this makes sure we actually implement that. None of our code has to change here. All of this is fine. We're just saying this can be built. But that's sort of that doesn't actually help us at all. Instead, let's add a, we did a builder. Let's add a timestamp now. I timestamped. And so this is going to return an iBuilder. And so you can kind of see we're starting at the back. We're starting at something that you can build with. And now we're just kind of moving the chain forward. So now we have this builder, or this timestamp, that returns a builder. So after you can construct a timestamp, after you add a timestamp, then you can add on a builder. But not before, unless something else returns it. And so you just keep going with this. So we're going to have this take a local date time, like so. And then we need one more for the content. So this will just be iContent, and it's just going to return an iTimestamp. And so nothing's really changing in our code besides adding those overrides. We're just making everything a little bit more explicit. Once you do content, you get an iTimestamp. The only thing you can do with an iTimestamp is call timestamp. And if you try to build it from that point, you'll get a compile error because that function doesn't exist on that class. Even though it's all on the same class, the compiler doesn't see it because it only knows that interface is being returned. So that's how this whole pattern works. I'm going to add two overrides here, like so. And then we just need to change these. So this is an iTimestamp, and this is an iBuilder. And now the final bit is just actually implementing these. So this will be an iContent and an iTimestamp, and then everything is good. This is all that we needed to add to this. But now we need one more bit. This no longer returns an iBuilder. You need it to return the first, or it no longer returns a builder. It no longer returns this class because that kind of defeats the entire purpose because you can just start wherever. Instead, we need to start it at iContent because that's the highest point. So we don't need to change anything. We just need to change the return type. And now nothing breaks here because we'd already done that. But if I go through this again, if I say greeting view model.builder, instead of getting those three classes like I got earlier, now we only get now we can only specify the content. And if so, I try to do build like we were doing earlier. This is a syntax error. That class, that interface, does not support the build function. And so we can actually just walk through this. And the cool thing is, if you're using like IntelliJ, its IntelliSense is actually going to know exactly what function you want. So you can literally just hit enter. And if you have something called content, it will just plug that in for you too from IntelliSense. So it actually works pretty well. It gets a little bit hairy when you have like branching code paths, but you can do it. I've done it. So content will just say, hello me. And then the next thing, timestamp. Only option is timestamp besides the generic object arguments. So let's just do a local date time dot now. Cool. And let's just build it. And so we get to the same point, unreachable statement, that's fine. We don't care about that because we already did that. But now, what if I want to make this optional? You don't need to specify a timestamp. If you don't, we're just going to use local date time dot now. So what we can do is have this I timestamp extend in iBuilder. And so what this does is it means our I timestamp, this guy, can extend in iBuilder, which means it also has the build function exposed. So after we do content, we can either build it or we can get the timestamp. And so this kind of allows you to do a branching path. Sometimes it makes sense to rename these. You get a lot of interfaces. I have one at work that is, I think, like 20 interfaces, which there's a trade-off here. This kind of setup is a little bit gross and can be a little bit hard to follow at times. So depending on what you're doing, it may or may not make sense to implement this. I still don't know if I like it, but I figured I'd throw it out there because I thought it was cool. So anyway, what this does is now we can do this iBuilder. If we build it and the timestamp is equal to null, then we want it to just be the local time dot now. So if the timestamp is equal to null, this is easy enough, right? Then the timestamp equals local date time dot now. And now, if I go back here, this becomes valid. It's still unreachable. Let me delete the correct one. There we go. So this is valid now. It wasn't previously, but because we added that extends, everything works. And we didn't really have to change anything besides adding this extra case, which we probably would have wanted in the first place. So theoretically, the only thing we would have had to have added was this little extends bit here. Note of caution, you don't use implements when you're extending an interface. You always use extends. It's a little bit, the wording's a little bit funky. Normally it's implements for interfaces. For interfaces, you use extends, even if you're doing an interface. I don't know. Anyway, that's sort of this whole idea. If I go back here, do this, let's just drop the content for whatever reason. You'll end up getting relatively helpful error messages. They're not the best. Can't find symbol timestamp on our builder, on our I content. You probably shouldn't be running into that kind of error because hopefully, since it's the only function that's actually showing up and in IntelliJ is the only function that's bolded, hopefully it's obvious. So yeah, that's sort of a take on the builder pattern. I will put a link to the blog that I was reading that kind of talked about this and kind of got me thinking about this. If you guys have any ideas or if you try this and have some feedback, I would love to hear it because I'm still playing with this myself and it would be really interesting if we could kind of talk about it and figure out, does it work? Is it a good idea? Or is it just adding additional complexity without much actual value? So I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and be free to go and drop those in the comments. But that's it for this video. So until next time, see you, Internet.